Alright guys, in today's video we're going to be looking at a problem where one wheel on the vehicle is dragging. And that's presumably either because of a problem with the parking brake or the primary brake. I'm going to show you how to identify which might be contributing to that problem, and then we'll go about a repair that's specific to these GMT900 type GM trucks. Alright, so the problem is on the driver's rear. So let's come over to the passenger rear to get a comparison for what the normal drag should be. We've got both wheels off the ground, jacked up. We got the front wheels chalked. We've got the transmission in neutral. So just taking a couple of fingers, we can move this wheel with just 3 fingers. In fact, we can just take the back of our hand, and just with friction, we can move this wheel. All right, so that would be normal. So now let's go see what we're comparing it against on the driver's side. All right, so on the driver's side, cannot get this to move with just even 5 fingers. Gonna have to put 2 hands on this wheel, and then we can get it to move. So something's definitely creating drag. Now, I'll insert a photo that we took off of a thermal camera when the owner first brought the vehicle over here, just to show you how hot the temperature was on the brake rotor. Now you can see in this picture that the temperature is well over what you'd see in an oven. So that's not normal. It should be well under half that much, even with a lot of braking and stop and go traffic. But we can't tell from that picture whether it's the parking brake or the primary brake. So here's some tests we're going to do. The first test we're going to do is we're going to put the parking brake on and see if that changes the behavior, just to confirm that it's operational. So I'm just going to step over, actuate the parking brake, and I'm going to confirm that I can no longer move this wheel. So that's my parking brake. So my parking brake is functional. So that tells me something. That at least tells me that that mechanism is not all bound up completely. It doesn't tell me, though, conclusively. To tell conclusively, what I'm going to have to do is take the wheel off. And I'm going to show you some tests that you can do taking the wheel off. To get the wheel off, we're going to need a 22 millimeter socket and some PPE and an impact wrench. And then we're just going to use a trim tool to pull this beauty cover off to expose these 6 22 millimeter nuts. We're going to spin these off, we're going to remove the wheel, and then I'm going to show you the next 2 tests. All right, with this wheel off and out of the way, what we're going to do now is we're going to try to figure out is it coming from the main brake and the caliper or the parking brake? And the easiest way to determine that is we're going to go ahead and compress this guy and see if that frees things up. So right, it's still very hard to turn. Although, you know, we can grab it easier like this, but it's still really hard to turn. So we're going to go ahead and compress the caliper and see if that frees it up. All right, so I'm going to use this pry bar to help us with testing this turn. All right, so it's still got a lot of force. Now I'm going to come in here with this C-clamp. This is just a straight up GM service manual procedure. And we're just going to give this some compression to take some of the pressure off. What we're doing is we're pushing against this outboard pad here very gently. And then we've got the other end of this on the housing of the caliper. And we're just going to give it a couple of turns and let it sit, let it equalize the pressure. A couple more turns. All right, so I've done maybe 2 turns, 2.5 turns tops. Take this off. See if anything changed. Yes. All right, so what does that tell us? That tells us that the parking brake's okay. This tells us that our binding is coming from the primary brake. So we've made progress. So now we know this is not a problem with the parking brake. It's not a problem with the bearing. It's a problem with this guy dragging. So now we're going to have to see if we can replicate this. So now that we can compress it and free it up, we're going to go back inside and we're going to pump the brakes And actually, we're going to start the engine and pump the brakes. So I'm going to need the camera person to help me. We're going to pump up the brakes, see if we can replicate the problem, and then we'll go about trying to figure out root cause. So root cause, if we got a problem with the brake here, it's either the caliper, the flexible hose, or the hard line that the flexible hose is connected to, which is right back up in here where my hand is. Right? So if it's related to the hard line, it means it got dented or nicked up, and we're going to have to do a visual inspection. If it's the hose, then it could have collapsed internally, and it's creating like a check valve effect. Now I'll show you two specific tests to eliminate the hose. If we don't find a problem with the hose, and we don't find a problem with the hard line, it's got to be the caliper. So let's go ahead and replicate the problem. All right, so hose inspection test, straight out of the service manual. I'm not going to use gloves for this because it's a visual inspection, but it's also a tactile inspection. So visual inspection wise, we're going to be looking to see if we see any physical damage to the hose. So an outside nick, abrasion, anything like that. I don't see anything inside or outside. Second test is tactile. What we're going to be feeling for is this hose should be very stiff and rigid. And if you come across a section that feels soft, that's a good indicator that the internal line has collapsed, which could be causing this effect. All right, so far, everything feels nice and rigid. And we only have to do this test right up to the crimp. It's just the rubber part that's subject to possibly having this kind of a problem. All right, so those two tests pass. I'm not feeling any soft spots anywhere along this hose. All right, there's one last test that we're going to do. So we're with the problem occurring. We're going to go over here and locate our bleeder valve on this particular guy right here. Move our light over a little bit so you guys can see. I'm going to take this dust cover off. All right, and I'm going to get an appropriately sized wrench. We're going to come in here and we're going to release the pressure on this bleeder valve. If that frees this caliper up again, then it is a hose problem. If it doesn't free up this caliper, then the hose is fine, and the only other thing we can suspect is either a problem with the hard line or the caliper itself. When you take a look at this hard line over here, like I mentioned earlier, it's a simple visual inspection. We're just going to come from here, and we're going to follow this hard line all the way over to where it joins up further up along the axle, and we're only interested in the hard line that feeds this wheel. We don't have to check all of them. All right, so we're just going to follow this line all the way to where it goes, and it eventually is going to go all the way up to the front. So we'll inspect that hard line and look for any nicks, but I'm not going to do that part right now because it's very, very unlikely for that to be damaged unless you had some accident or hit something. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go skip right to the caliper test and see what we get. All right, that bleeder is a 10 millimeter. Still got a lot of pressure. I'm going to come back here and we're going to release the pressure on this guy. So my experience, when you got a problem and it's the hose, when we do this, we should have some brake fluid ejecting from the bleeder. Let's see if we can get this in here where you guys can see. So I'm going to open this up a little bit. And right now I'm not seeing anything yet. Yep, there it is. It's starting to drizzle out. But it didn't come out with a lot of force. So I'm going to tighten this back up. I'm going to see what happened to our problem. It got a little better. So that's telling me that the hose is likely our problem. This should not have gotten better just from releasing that. However, I should have saw more force coming out. And that concerns me because, you know, not seeing the force, what I'm used to seeing is a lot of force when the problem is the hose. That's prompting me to want to go back and recheck all of this for a soft spot. It's also possible that we're dealing with multiple problems. We could have a hose that started to go bad, And then we could have a caliper that's starting to go bad. These are all OEM parts, so these parts are all from 2013 on this particular vehicle. So what, 12 years old at this point? I'm going to repeat this test a couple more times before I make a call, and I'll bring you guys back with what we end up deciding to do. All right, guys, I did this test a second and a third time. Right, so we're not getting but little drizzles out of the bleeder. And it starts off, and you can see down here, just take a look down here, right down here. You can see it's dripping, right? And it starts off still very hard to turn. Very hard to turn. So this is kind of like, it's unusual, like, 1 out of 3 tests didn't give me the kind of results I was expecting, but 2 out of 3 did. So I'm kind of leaning to that this is a caliper problem, because it just doesn't seem strong enough symptom-wise to be the hose itself. So I had that thing almost completely unscrewed, and we were just getting a little bit of a drizzle out of it. So we're going to go ahead and call the caliper. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up a caliper for this, an OEM GM caliper for this. We'll pick up a hose too, but we're going to just replace the caliper. I'm fairly certain that's all it is. In General Motors service, you're not required, let me say that again, you're not required to replace these things in pairs. The only part that you're required to replace in a pair are the friction material, the pads. So if you have a bad caliper on one side, you do not have to replace it on the other side. The kind of logic some people follow about, oh, you got to replace that one, you might as well replace all 4. And that's ridiculous. You replace the one that's failing. But friction material, yes, you always want to replace in pairs on sides so you don't get uneven braking. So now that we've got a repair strategy, are we done? No, because we don't know how long this problem's been going on. The owner feels like it just happened a couple of days ago. Maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. So the next thing we want to see is collateral damage. So we're going to look at this rotor now. And what we're looking on the rotor is, do we see any heat marks, any bluing that might indicate that this has been happening for a while? And I really don't see any heat marks, which is a good sign. That means we might be able to reuse this OEM rotor. And again, this is an OEM GM rotor. It's a made in the USA part. This is not like this inferior Chinesium stuff you might pick up at the auto parts store. A rotor like this would probably cost 4, 5, 6 times as much as one of those auto parts store rotors. So we definitely want to try and salvage this. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the caliper off, and I'm going to show you some measurements we can take to determine if this rotor has warped. All right, so we're going to need to secure this rotor. These little push nuts, these copper push nuts, these things are put on by the factory just to keep the rotor drum assembly from popping off as you go down the assembly line. That's really the only purpose they serve. Some people like to keep them on there. So if I find them on there, I don't get rid of them, I keep them. But you can just kind of unscrew them off of here. This one here looks like it might even be broken. I'm not going to bore you with taking them both off, but they just kind of unscrew. If you're servicing somebody else's vehicle and they've got them and you toss them, you're just going to cause drama. So you might as well just leave them alone. All right, so we need to secure this, but we're not going to use the original lug nuts. You notice the original lug nuts are chamfered like this. And if we were to torque these down without the wheel being here, we're going to damage this mating surface, and we're going to transfer that damage to the alloy wheel. So we don't use the wheel nuts unless you happen to have a set of canonical washers that sit on here and protect this. Now, that's what the dealership would use, but we don't have that. So what we're going to use is, in this kind of situation, I just keep a bag of regular 14 millimeter flat washers, 2.5 millimeter thick. This is just to approximate the wheel. And put these on here, and then we're just going to have a set of M14 by 1.5 nuts. We're going to put these on here and pull this guy off, and we'll come back. So let me just get this going, and we'll come back and I'll show you these next 2 tests. All right, we're just going to go around and tighten these with a 22 millimeter wrench. This is just to get them snugged up for this phase. We're going to have to eventually come back around and torque them down. And the way we'll torque them down is we'll use a 140 foot-pound torque stick with a 22 millimeter deep socket because we've got this stud length sticking out. But we'll do that off camera. There's nothing to see there. We're going to do that because I'm going to show you some measurements we're going to take on the rotor. We're going to go ahead and work on pulling the caliper off because that's the part that we're going to condemn. The collateral damage test is to see, do we also have to replace the rotor? If we have to replace the rotor, then we're going to have to replace the pads, and that'll have to be on both sides. But we're only going to replace the caliper on this side for the reasons we already went through. Now, these are OEM, made in the USA type rotors. Way more expensive. 5-6 times more expensive than the Chinesium stuff you'd get in the auto parts store. So we do need to do a test to see if we can salvage these, particularly because they're not that old. So that test requires us to have the normal clamping force on the rotor as if the wheel were torqued down to spec. That's what the 140 foot-pounds are in these GMT900 trucks. And then those measurements will tell us whether this rotor has got any warpage at all. To get this guy off, we're going to need a 20 millimeter wrench to hold the slide pin, to keep that from moving. And we're going to need a 13 millimeter to get this greenish colored OEM guide pin bolt off. While we're here, one of the other tests that we can do now that we've got this tightened down is we can see if we've got any movement on our slide pins. Make sure they're not like seized up, and I do see them wiggling a little bit, which is a good sign. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pull this guy off. I doubt I can get it off by hand. Sufficient angle and torque will probably preclude being successful at this, but we'll give it a quick shot and see. Now we're not going to get that off by hand. All right, before we go grab the impact wrench, I'm just going to try a longer manual wrench first. Let's see. There we go. Okay, we just needed some more leverage. All right, we got to get the flashlight into a position that doesn't get in my way. And this longer flex head 13 was the trick. And we should be able to get this guy out by hand at this point. All right, these bolts from GM that have this kind of iridescent greens coating to them, there's some type of a thread locker sealant on them as well, but like you saw in the manual, they tell you to discard them. When I go to my local GM dealer, they've got like a bin of these things because they go through, dozens of them every week. All right. Now we should be able to just get this caliper to flip down, but I think we're going to have to compress it first, just like we did in that first test, just because of the problem we've got going on. And again, I'm being very gentle when I do this because I'm wanting to reuse these pads. So that's why we're just going to give it just slow turns, just enough to get some gap in there. Okay. And then I'm hoping at this point yep, she'll fold down. All right. So why do I want to do that? Well, I want to see if I can get a flashlight. And I want to see if I see anything with the piston boot binding up or leaking or anything like that. I mean, got some cobwebs in here, so looks like the spider had a home until he got cooked out. I don't immediately see anything, so we're going to go ahead and pull the bottom bolt now. So let me go ahead and pull the bottom bolt, and I'll bring you back after we get that out. All right, guys, so this is a good page out of the service manual that talks about advice on how to locate a problem with either the hard lines, which they call the brake pipe, or the flexible lines, which is referred to as a brake hose in GM jargon, right? And so they go through this little picture showing you what could happen, right? So externally, you could have some damage that takes this inner liner and forces it in, which cuts down on flow. Or you could just have a situation where this inner liner gives way and creates a restriction on flow. And so those tests we did earlier would try to spot condition 1 or condition 2. Condition 2 you can feel tactile wise, where it's a soft spot at the point where that occurs. You can also spot kinks and rubbing and that sort of thing. Now the other thing I was telling you about was on the inspection for problems, right? And so cracks, which we don't have, heat spots, which we don't have, and then excessive bluing, discoloration. You'll actually see like a blue sheen to the steel when it has these heat problems. And if you catch this early enough, you won't have this, which seems to be the problem with the vehicle we're working on. But still, to make sure, we're going to go through these 2 tests, right? So one is we're going to use a micrometer, and we're going to take a measurement in 4 locations, 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 3 o'clock, and we're going to measure the thickness with a micrometer. And then we're going to do a lateral runout, and that's going to be, this is the part where they talk to you about if you're going to use the lug nuts, you've got to have these canonical type of washers. It sits in here. You can see that to protect the lug nuts. They have a part number on that if you're interested for the OEM ones, J45101-100 canonical brake rotor washers, but you can just do what I'm doing with some regular ones. And then we're going to mount up a dial indicator on a part of a runout gauge, and then we're going to spin this guy around with everything torqued down, and we're going to see if that's also in specification. If we pass both those tests, then we're reusing this rotor. That's just the end of the discussion. You know, this is the service manual guidance. This is the Bible. If it passes those tests, we reuse it. If it doesn't pass those tests, we replace it. We might be able to turn it. So they mention over here, right, that if you fail this test, right, you could try refinishing the rotor, which means taking it to a machine shop and having them turn it versus replacement. And an OEM one, because of the cost, it's always worth a machine shop trip rather than a straight-up replacement. All right, and then the last thing is on the replacement of the caliper, right? And so as we go down through this rear disc pad replacement on a 1500 series, this truck is a 1500, we can see over here that it's important that we're reusing these pads, right? There's a couple of things here, right? So do not use any air tools to remove the guide pin bolts. Use hand tools. Those things are on there pretty tight. I'm not going to suggest using an air tool, but we'll try with a longer wrench. But if not, we're going to have to use an impact wrench to break it loose. And then we can use hand tools to get the rest of the way. What they're concerned about with this is that you might damage the pins. So that's what that advice is there for. Make sure you use an open-end wrench to hold that guide pin while you loosen the guide pin bolt, which is what we just tried to do. If you're reusing the pads, which I hope we are, you're going to take note of their position as well as the spring clip's position, because we're going to put everything back exactly the way it has currently worn on the old caliper onto the new caliper. Now, if we end up having to replace the rotor, we'll discard this step because we'll be using all new hardware. But I'm going to go with the assumption that we're going to be able to just replace the caliper and not have to do anything else. Let's see. Lubing up the mating surfaces, just the usual pad type procedure. I'll put a link to a pad replacement video for this truck up in the upper right. And then the most important thing, you have to install new caliper guide pin bolts. Those guide pin bolts are not reusable on this model vehicle. That would be part number 1 here. So those have to be replaced. All right, let's get into it. All right, we got both of these little iridescent blue special bolts off. Just going to have this guy held up here by a bungee. You know, I don't see, you know, this is just the brake fluid that ran down during the test. I don't see any damage, you know, to the piston other than just what I just touched there. Just once again trying to look for something conclusive here, but not seeing it. But we're going to go ahead and swap this guy out. So he's held in with a 13. And we're going to keep this propped up here until we're done, because this is one of the things that can cause these hoses to get damaged, is people let the caliper hang down by them when they're doing work, right? That puts pressure on this when you let it drag down that gravity. Another thing people do is they put like a pinch-off clamp on here. That also damages the internals. When they get old, you can get away with that when they're new, but when they get old, it can cause this kind of damage that we're seeing. But like I said, we didn't see anything to say that we should condemn this guy. All right, so let me show you what we're replacing it with. So we're going to replace this with a GM 8678 5193. This is a left-hand side. I'll put the part number for the right-hand side down in the descriptions. This is a USA-made, genuine OEM part, not something Chinesium. And inside the box, it's going to be all ready to go, ready to install. It's going to have a, looks like it's a new style of bleeder cap now. Instead of the old style, it's just like this little hat. Looks like there's now a retainer for it. And it's got a cover over here, which is where our hose is going to connect. Now, our hose connects in with a couple of copper gaskets. And those are going to be a GM part number 2101 2386. And we're going to have to use a couple of these copper gaskets on either side of the banjo bolt for this guy here, right? So this hose, when we take him off, this bolt's going to be going through this hole here, and there's a copper gasket on either side of this guy. And then that's what we're going to use to reinstall it on this. And then we're going to torque it down, we'll reinstall it, and then this part will be done. But before we do any of this, I told you we were going to do these tests. So let's get geared up to do these tests on the rotor to see if we end up having to replace more than just the caliper here. All right, for this next test, we're going to take 4 measurements, like I said. One here, one about here, one about here, and one where the pads are. So since I can't get to where I want to get to for that, I'm just going to make a mark here, and then when I rotate it around, I'm going to put a 4 there. And then we're going to take a micrometer, and we're going to come in on the first position about a 1/2 inch. I'm going to tighten it up. Let me see if I can get this so you guys can see it. Flashlight is not real happy here. See if I can get him to stay put. There he goes. All right, and I'm just going to snug this guy up. And then if we zoom in here, you're going to write down 3 numbers. So we're going to count off, and we're going to see a 7. So we're going to write a 7 down. It's the easiest way to use one of these tools. And then we're going to count the number of ticks past the 7. This is going to be a bit of an eye test, but it looks like 1, 2, 3 ticks past the 7. And then past that, we're going to read what's on this thimble past 0. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4 ticks. I'll show you how to translate that into thousandths. We're going to go ahead and make this measurement in all 4 positions and come back. All right, with that thickness test done, now we're going to do the runout test. So for that, we've got a runout gauge set up, which is effectively just a pair of vice grips with a flexible arm with a dial indicator attached to the end. We've just picked an arbitrary point that we've marked in a Sharpie with an arrow, and we've zeroed out the tool. And now we're just going to do a 360 rotation, and we're going to take note of the readings that we get. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. And again, you got to remember that these all need to be torqued down to 140 foot-pounds for this particular test. All right, as we slowly run through this, 1, 2. As we give it force, it's going to move a little bit, so you have to stop. So far we haven't seen any deviation. It's 1/1000. 2. Still 2. Still 2. Still 2. Still 2. Still 2. 1. Nothing. 1, 1, 1, nothing, 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 and we're back to our starting position. 1. All right, we're going to go back to service manual and see what this and the previous results tell us, but I think this rotor is salvageable. All right, so we got done with these tests. We had 3 that were exactly the same and 1 that was slightly different. So like this first one here, we got the 7, we've got the 3 ticks down here. Actually, make sure I got this exactly where I had it. Yep, right there. All right, so that was what we had. So we had the 3 ticks, then we had the 4 ticks up from the 0. And then this one we had 2 and 3. So these guys are worth 0.025, and these guys are worth 0.005. And what that ends up being for both is we've got 3 that are at 0.802 and 1 that's at 0.752. If we look at the service manual for this test, you got to go take a look at your RPO sticker. If you don't know what your RPO sticker is, I'll put a video up here on the right so you can tell what an RPO sticker is, but it's also known as a service information label. And that, for us, is going to be JD9 for the rears, because we're on the rear brakes. And what that tells us is that we can't have any of these measure points be less than 0.748. So that's the lowest it could be without having to do any work. And then if it goes below 0.728, you have to toss the rotor, recycle it, and replace it because it can't be machined. You can correct up at this point through a machine shop. So we had 0.0802 and 0.752, so we passed. The rotor's fine here. Now let's go take a look at the dial caliper information. All right, let's interpret the results of our dial caliper test, right? So you can see the same setup that the dealership would use is what we're using, except, just be a different, more expensive brand tool. And we come down here, we can see, again, it's based on the RPO of the truck. In our case, we have RPO JD9 rear brakes. And what they're telling us is we rotate this through, we shouldn't see any more than 0.002. So as we went through this rotation, I'm going to call this a pass, but some of you are going to say, hey, I saw in a couple of places that the little half indicator on the dial lit up, so it would be 0.002.5. Shouldn't you round up? And I'm going to say no, because number one, this is a Harbor Freight tool that I'm using, and that's well within its margin of error, let's be honest, folks. And also because as we do this type of a test, there is a margin of error in it. So 0.0, half, is not enough for me to call it. If I was reading 0.003 or 4 straight up, I would take this rotor to the machine shop. For what I'm reading that you guys just saw, we're going to call it good. We're going to reuse the rotor, and we're going to reuse the pads, and we're just going to change the caliper. All right, before we pull off the hose to the caliper, we want to mark the level of the brake fluid in the master cylinder here. You can either use a Sharpie, or you can do something more temporary like I'm doing with just a piece of painter's tape. Because we're going to put this back no higher than the current level it's at to account for the wear of the pads on the other 3 brakes. All right, to change this out, we're just going to get everything ready. Now there's a core charge from GM with these, so we're going to want to put the old one in the box and send it back and they rebuild it. Get a couple of these copper gasket washers out, and then we're going to need an 11 millimeter. I'm going to put on a breaker bar here. Let's see if we can get this guy off by hand. There we go. It's going to start spewing brake fluid. It's unavoidable. I mean, it's going to go everywhere, guys. There's nothing you can do. Hit a little snag here somewhere. All right, we'll take this guy down, push this through so we can get this copper washer off of here. He's stubborn. I'm going to have to get a little pick to get that off so we can get this guy to let go. This is what makes the seal here, so expected to be on a little tight. Might not be able to get it with this little baby pry bar, though. I'm going to have to get something bigger. Alright, so it's a very soft metal, copper, so we don't want to clamp too hard with these vice grips. Just enough to hold it so that we can see if we can just unscrew it like that. Is it moving? Yeah, okay, so that'll be the technique that we can use. Just going to have to use a regular ratchet because it's just too slippery for the palm ratchet. And it's coming off. It's just going to be a long haul here, guys. All right, there's one. See, the other one just came right off. Don't know what the deal was with that bottom one. When I put these on, there's kind of like a smooth and a rough end. I like putting the smooth end up. Have that facing the sealing surface. All right. We'll go ahead and if you look down here, we're going to pull this little shipping cover off. And we're going to bring this guy in and hand thread him to start. Get as tight as we can by hand, and then we're going to get it mounted. And then we're going to need to put new bolts on here, but for now I'm just going to use one of the old ones. I just want to get it where it won't fall. Alright, we're just going to use that to hold it. Now we're going to come in here and torque this guy up before we lose any more brake fluid to 30 foot-pounds. That'll crush these copper gaskets. All right, now we're done. Let me get a couple of new bolts. So the part number on these guide pin bolts that you got to replace are 2582 3358. I go through a lot of these. You see brand new. It's still got that iridescent kind of blue color, and then it's got this kind of yellow treatment on the inside. Let's take this old one that we reused for a second. Get this guy started. Now, what about the guide pins? Well, the guide pins are fine. I'll get this guy in the bottom and I'll show you. Number one, they just had new pads and rotors put on this truck late last year. So we're nowhere near the time. Take this guy back out for a second. Just slide it back out. All right, we can see that these guys are moving nice and fine. And I checked the bottom one already. They're fine from the last maintenance, so we don't have to do anything with them. These guys are going to get torqued to 28 foot-pounds. And they're going to be a 13. So let me reposition the camera because we're starting to get some glare here, and we'll go get these guys tightened up. All right, we got the bottom one coming in with the 20 again. 13 on the guide bolts. Just going to run it down by hand first. Remember, no power or pneumatic tools like the service manual suggests. All right, once that's snug, we'll switch to our torque wrench. 28 foot-pounds. Again, holding things with our 20. All right, we're ready to get some brake clean it up, and then bleed the brakes. All right, now we're going to give it some brake clean treatment to get all the spilled brake fluid from this procedure off of here. Because I won't be able to tell if something's leaking if we don't get rid of all that. And then we're going to take our 22 and we're going to get this guy in here, and then we're going to go ahead and remove these nuts and washers because we don't need them anymore. All right, guys, while we've been bleeding the brakes, right, here's another view. Get this out of the way for a second. All right, here's another view that our slides are working just fine, right? No problem with that. And what we've been doing with bleeding these brakes is, if we come over here to the left, right, I'm just using a power bleeder catch container. And we come up from the bottom, and we take this little silicone hose, and we get it over the nipple of this bleeder. A little bit awkward to do from the angle I'm at because you guys are in the way. And then we come in with our 10 millimeter wrench, right? And we just have the camera person get inside and press the pedal down, and we open this guy up until we don't see any bubbles, and we close it, and we just rinse and repeat until we don't get any bubbles. Then we keep topping off the master cylinder back to where we put the tape. In fact, we're going to go up there now and check that and top it off because I think we're done with this first one. All right, with each wheel that we bleed, starting with the one we changed the caliper on, we got to watch this level and bring it back to where it was. So we're going to be topping it off with some AC Delco DOT3. It's an AC Delco 10 4110 or a GM 1935 3126. Just going to bring that level back up to the tape that we put on to begin with. And then we're going to do it again. So we start with the wheel that we replaced, but then we need to check all of them because we let air into the system. All right, we got our two push pins back on. Some people feel better if they're there. Just going to give it a quick squirt of fluid film, then we're going to get the wheel mounted. We'll put the lug nuts back on, torque it down to 140 foot-pounds, and take it for a test drive. All right, we took it for one quick test drive. Nothing sounds strange. It doesn't seem to be overheating or dragging. We're going to take it for a longer 15-mile run, but I did want to talk to you about, well, what if this wasn't it? So if we ended up needing to replace that hose, on this side, it would have been a 2590 6097 from GM or an AC Delco 176 1528. It's a different part number for the right-hand side. I'll put them both down in the video description. These guys come with those copper gasket washers on both ends as well as a new banjo bolt. So it's an all assembly ready to go. Your hard line would screw in here, and then there's a retaining bolt that screws in here, and that's all there is to it. I'll roll the torque for these two down on the bottom of the video in case you end up needing to replace just the hose. If it's not this hose, like we were saying, and it wasn't the caliper, then we would have went for a hunt to see if there was some damage to the hard line running all the way from the end of this hose all the way up to the ABS module. We would just scan the bottom of the truck looking for that. But in this case, I think we've called it correctly with the caliper. We're going to go take a longer test drive, maybe 10-15 miles, and see how it performs. All right, guys, 15-mile test drive, heavy braking, over 100 degrees less after this repair. So this is getting close to what I would say is normal. If we take a look at the caliper itself, it's even cooler. So I think this is a good repair. We'll do a couple more test drives. It definitely does not have that heat smell like when the owner first brought it in, where you could just, you could just smell something like something was hot or starting to burn. So I think we caught this early enough that this is a good repair. Got to take it for a few more test drives, like I said. If I bring it back with any problems, I'll let you guys know, but otherwise I think we're done. So if this video helped you figure out how to tell what's dragging on your rear end of your GMT900 truck, whether it be the parking brake or the primary brake, and how you can go about determining what other parts might need to be repaired once you determine if it's the caliper or the hose or both. Appreciate you paying it forward by hitting that like button. And as always, thanks for watching.